Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about whether or not it is worth reading The Expanse. Here are just some quick stats about The Expanse. The Expanse is a space opera in the subgenre of science fiction. It is comprised of nine novels and 8 additional novellas, and I did read all 9 novels and 8 novellas, and I kind of just read them all in publication order or in whatever order they kind of fit in between the main novels. The novellas fit in between those. And that, I did audio it, and that is 177 hours and 48 minutes of audio, or about 5,000 pages, and the novellas add an additional 16 hours and 13 minutes for about another 500 pages or so. So that is a grand total of 5,524 pages, or about 194 hours and 1 minute, or 8 days of your life. So it is definitely a long series that definitely is a commitment, but it's also not like crazy long like Wheel of Time or anything like that. This is a series that took me about a year or so to read. I did about a novel a month, or just about, not exactly. And I started it last year in May of 2022. So I did just recently finish it, and it is definitely an interesting series. It was able to produce my second favorite book of all time, which was book 8 of this series, which is Time Match Wrath. But not all books are up to the same standard as that. So let's talk about why you should read it and why you shouldn't read it, and we'll go ahead and start with why you should. So the first main selling point for this series is how it is a very long journey. This is a multi-decade spanning journey that has many different plots with kind of one main through line throughout. And I say that because it's almost split into sections. The first 3 or so books kind of have a different kind of plot and almost feel to them. The next 4 or so books, 3 or 4 books, kind of have a different feel, and you're kind of evolving with the changes that occurred in that first chunk, and then, the last 3, or however the math works out there, have, it's definitely the following action of everything that's been going on. And that's a huge positive for me, and it's really well done, which is another difficult thing. There are a lot of series out there and a lot of authors who just wouldn't be able to do that. You would just kind of, get branched off into too many different things, and it would really kind of bloat the series. And while this is a long series, I don't think there's a lot of bloat. There's not the slog that Wheel of Time has or anything like that. It is moving along for the most part, and it's really well done. Like I said, not a lot of authors could do it the way this is done, where that main through line is still progressing and referenced, but the subplots that are going on feel almost just as important as that main one that you're going through. With there being so many, calling them subplots isn't exactly the right way to put it, but that's kind of how I've always referenced them. But with that being said, that means there's a lot of different things for you to like. And so even if you don't like one plot, you know that you're not stuck with it forever. You know that's not going to be the next sole purpose other than that one main through one, which I guess if you don't like that, then you're going to have an issue with the series. But you have so many different avenues that you get to explore that it really kind of ticks a lot of boxes, and a wide variety of people would like it. Outside of the world, there are some fantastic characters in this series. You have your main crew, who you will basically become family with, and that's another trope that the series expounds upon, is the found family trope. I know a lot of people really like that, and it's not one that always works for me, but in this aspect, in this series, it definitely works. The found family, and how close some of the characters are able to get, and just how real a lot of the relationships feel, and not always in a romantic way. That's a problem that I have a lot of times in series, where any male-female relationship always turns into some kind of romantic thing. And while there are definitely romantic aspects between some of the characters in this, it feels very realistic, but there are also a lot of great platonic relationships that are formed. And that's something I would love to see more of, where not everything needs to be romantic. People can just be friends and work closely together and still love each other, but not necessarily in a romantic way. And that is something that this series did a really, really good job with multiple different characters. It wasn't just a small subset or, 1 or 2. There are, probably close to 8 to 12 characters where they're all intertwined and have different relationships with each other that all just feel very realistic. Like in real life, you have a lot of people that you'll know and communicate with, and you'll have those cross friendships where, you know, some of your friends know your other friends, and, you know, it just, this series just wraps all that up beautifully. There are definitely moments in this series that will be very sad, will be very happy. You will feel the successes and the failures of the characters immensely in this series. It might take you a couple books to get there with different characters, but there are some of the best characters I've ever read in this. And, you know, that is just why I love this series as much as I do. It's really the characters. As cool as the setting is, the characters are definitely the biggest selling point. I've mentioned in that with the characters some of the realistic aspects of the series, and that's something I want to touch in, just kind of its own positive. This series feels very realistic. Not just in its setting, which does feel very realistic. I've read a decent amount of sci-fi, and a lot of the science fiction, some of it just feels so far out there that it's kind of hard for me to believe that this is where humanity could get to. That is not the case with The Expanse. The realistic aspect, it feels very, very possible. You know, you have different factions, you have based on planets, which that's a realistic thing we see on Earth today. You know, where you're born and where you're from, you know, there's kind of that cultural tribalism around that. And I don't see why it would be any different as, you know, humanity expanded into the stars. And so that's something that I think is handled really well. And another realistic thing is the technology isn't so far out there that it's almost magic. You know, there are definitely, like, obviously advanced technology that might be too good to be true, but in general, it's just close enough on the cusp of, like, ooh, we could get there in my lifetime kind of stuff, that I think is a huge positive, because, like I said, so many series go so far into the future that it's basically magic, you know. So that's something that's done really well. Sticking with the realism, choices that characters make, so these two kind of get blended together, do feel realistic. There's not many times when I was reading through the series where I was like, no person would make this choice. This isn't a realistic choice that a rational person would make. And, you know, that includes villains. You know, in fantasy specifically, there are a lot of times where we just get a villain who's a villain because they're a villain. That is why. Their reasoning behind it is either very weak or non-existent. They just are the bad guy. And the villains or the characters you're not going to like still feel very real. Like, it's like you can understand almost why they're doing it, some more than others, but in general, you know, they have a cause that they're behind, and that's just really great. And with those choices being made, there are definitely consequences for people's actions, no matter how realistic they are. That's another part of it, is the consequences that come back. There's definitely a lot of political maneuvering and stuff, which some people will like and some won't. I personally enjoyed it, but once again, all of that just felt very grounded and real, and just well done. Another really cool thing that the series does is it does have cool space stuff. And it's not so unrealistic, once again, so it's not like magic, but there is some, like, big, like, overarching cool space stuff that you get to see, which personally I like to see in my science fiction. I don't need it to just all be philosophical. You know, that is a route that a lot of science fiction goes to. So to just get some, like, cool space stuff, like, I don't know, and it also fit very well in this world, that it was just cool, big, out of this world, imaginative. And so I think it worked really well. And just for some why you should read it stuff that is kind of outside of the aspect of the story itself, like the actual written stuff, is there's an adaptation. Some people are really into adaptations and they really like getting to see that. I haven't watched it. I think it was originally a, like, sci-fi TV series, and then Amazon bought it and did it up to a certain point. I don't know if they did all of it, but you know, some people really like it. Maybe at some point I will watch it. I mentioned the adaptation. This series also has a lot to give in the fact that there are those 8 novellas. Now, do you have to read them? No. Would I recommend it? Yes, I think I would. I think it adds, like, an extra layer of depth, and it definitely shows you some things that are going on outside but around the main narrative in the novels. I would say that there are 2 novellas that I think are definitely mandatory reading, which would be Strange Dogs and Oberon. Those 2 felt like they were chapters or maybe prologues that kind of didn't make it into the book and got made as novellas. Outside of those two, I think you could skip everything, but I wouldn't recommend it. And the last thing I will mention for the good or the why you should read it section is the growth of the authors. James S.A. Corey, that's two authors technically, that they go through throughout the series is very noticeable. The quality of writing from the first book to the last book is completely different. They really stepped up their game throughout the series, and some of those later books have really, really good writing. It's like they really solidified what they wanted to do and how they wanted to do it, and they really had a plan for how to accomplish that. And so that's, to me, something I kind of want to see in a series where it progresses and the writing gets better. I guess if it stays the same, that's fine, as long as it starts off with a high quality, but you don't want it to get worse or stay at that poor level, and that's definitely not the case with this. So now let's change gears and maybe talk about some of the reasons why you shouldn't read it or why you wouldn't like it. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is the first book, Leviathan Wakes. I think it is a super weak entry for the series. I had a decent amount of issues with this book. I liked it. I ended up giving it 3 stars. So, I mean, I thought it was fine. I did like it. I enjoyed it. It made me want to keep reading, so it was good enough. But I think there are some really big flaws in this book. I think the story takes you in a direction that you don't expect from a space opera. It makes sense as you read through the series, and like I can understand why this is the direction they went with the first book, but it's not a strong entry, which is sad when you're thinking of committing to a series this long. And the first book it wasn't a disappointment for me, but I could see why it would be for a lot of people. Maybe your expectations are set wrong because you hear a lot of positive things about this series. And the fact that the first book kind of whiffs as far as the series go is definitely a disappointment. There are definitely some very good things about that book. I read it so long ago now, I couldn't probably do a review justice, but in general, it's a week. I did a tier list where I ranked all of the Expanse, and I think it was definitely my least favorite novel, and it might have even been behind Strange Dogs and Oberon, the 2 short stories and novellas, because that's just kind of how I felt about it. And that's definitely maybe a reason you wouldn't want to continue with the series if you gave Leviathan Wakes a chance and kind of felt like I did, well, or worse than I did, because I liked it enough, but it's definitely not putting its best foot forward as a series. The Expanse kind of straddles this fine line where it's not too hard sci-fi, and it's also not like the Martian, Project Hail Mary light sci-fi, where it's kind of like some math and science is happening, don't worry about it, it makes sense. And it's not so far hard where it's a textbook. It's kind of, centers kind of in the middle, maybe a little bit closer to the hard sci-fi. But if you want one or the other, that's going to be a big negative for you. If you really like to dive deep into like the nitty gritty of some random physics equation that only makes sense to like 6 people in the world, this isn't that, the science in this series might not work for you. And if you really like the light, fluffy, like, oh, we don't need to worry too much about it, maybe you can get over it, but sometimes that tonal line that it tries to go tilters one way or the other, and that can be a negative. And sometimes, like I mentioned earlier, the sections of the series, they kind of filter one way or the other. So it's kind of one of those things where, depending on how you feel about the level of hard sci-fi in your book, you might not enjoy the series that much. I mentioned in the why you should read it section all of the plots that you get and how some of them are going to work for you and some of them aren't, but how in general they're really good and they touch on a wide variety of things. I'm going to go ahead and kind of throw that into the negatives as well. There are going to be some plots that you do not connect with, and there are going to be some books because of that you do not enjoy to the same level of other books in the series. And so it's that double-edged sword where there were definitely some plot threads where I just didn't care. It was not the telescope lens wasn't focused on the part of the story that I wanted to be focused on. I wanted us to be somewhere else, but it's not where we were. And, depending on how you feel about some of those, you'll feel completely differently than I did, or you'll feel the same way I do. And with a series like this, it's just kind of one of those things you have to navigate and hope that it's not so towards one way or the other of what you like or don't like, that you get sucked into it too much. I know there's definitely 1 or 2 books where I still enjoyed them, but I was like, man, I would much rather be with X, Y, and Z character somewhere else than where we were with the characters we were with. Another thing you might not like is if you want super, super far away, you know, I kind of mentioned this in the positive as well, technology, where, you know, it doesn't even really seem possible. If that's something you're into in your science fiction, you know, where they're breaking all kinds of laws of physics and, you know, kind of stuff like that, you know, this is a much more grounded, realistic, I've said that a couple times, technology level that humanity is at. And while that somewhat changes throughout the series with how far humanity has come, if you want to hit the ground running with like faster than light travel or, you know, all kinds of stuff like that, you know, this isn't gonna, you know, fit what you want. If you are not a fan of time skips, I'm not gonna say when in the series the time skip happens or why or anything like that. There is a time skip in the series, and it is a pretty substantial time skip. I won't even say how long, so I don't, you know, I'll try to keep that as spoiler-free as possible. But if you don't like time skips, if you want to be there for every single thing that happens throughout everything, well, you know, that's something you're going to have to deal with in this series. I know some people do not like time skips. They want to be there. Technically, the time skip is getting filled with, I believe they're releasing some comics or some graphic novels that are supposed to fill in the time gap of the time skip. But I don't know when that's even coming out or what. I think I saw that it was a Kickstarter, so, you know, depending on how you feel about that, I don't know how widely available this will be after the fact. So yeah, time skips personally didn't bother me in this series. It has in others, so, you know, that's just going to have to be one of those things that you decide for yourself how you feel about it. And the very last negative I will say is, even with how big the universe that The Expanse is set in, sometimes it feels a little too small. There's a little bit of everybody's in where they need to be for this thing to happen. Just a little bit. It's not too bad. I only thought about it one or two different times, and it all works together. And, you know, I think suspension of disbelief in a series like this is something that you're going to come in anyways. But, you know, there's maybe one or two times where I was like, really, everybody just happened to be where we needed them to be exactly when we needed them to be there? Okay, that's, I mean, okay, I guess. So if that's something that bothers you, you know, it might take you out of it a little bit more, or you might even notice some more instances of that than I do, because that's not something that normally bothers me. So that's just another thing to consider as well. So overall, The Expanse is definitely a series I would recommend to people who like fantasy, or not fantasy, like sci-fi, or like long series that a lot of fantasy readers like. You know, obviously, I just went through a lot of points, but I think in general, this is a decently easy to recommend book, or series. I would say you definitely need to get through at least book 2 or 3 if to decide, which I know sucks. It's like I have to commit to 3 of these books before I can really, you know, get a feel for it. But I think book 1 really sets you up with wrong expectations and then goes from there, and the universe really builds out in those next 2 books. So if you're kind of on the fence after book 1, I would say at least give the next 2 a chance. If book 1 is just so bad to you that you think it's a complete dumpster fire, I don't think you'll probably turn around and change your mind, but you might. So, you know, you gotta figure that part out for yourself. But I would give this a light recommendation to a large number of people, because I do think this series has a number of issues, and I think a lot of those issues are definitely early on, which can make it difficult to recommend. But that is everything I have for The Expanse. I hope you liked the video, and have a good one.